There are certain people in life that influence the way you think and operate. For me, Allen Krantz is one of those people. He's a composer, performer, transcriber, and as far as I'm concerned, a philosopher. I was a student of his for several years, and he had a monumental influence on how I perform, listen to, and even consider music. He has a unique way in looking at things in that he doesn't only see things from a certain angle, but he sees them from all angles. He's also a professional member of the Classical Guitar Society. So when he told me he was going to publish his transcriptions of some Weiss sonatas, I jumped at the chance to interview him. Please enjoy my interview with Allen Krantz. So welcome, Allen. It's a pleasure to be talking with you again. Just a little preface here. So you just had this published. It's the Weiss Suites, and we are here to sort of do like a little bit of a press release here and talk to basically a general audience to the professional player. So in your preface, you already provide a good wealth of information around these transcripts, history, performance notes, etc. But I want to touch on really what led you to transcribing this specific set of sonatas.
Okay. I sort of addressed that in the introduction, the sort of personal note in the introduction, but what happened was when I went to Stanford back in the 70s for graduate school in early music performance practice, there was a very interesting guy there named Douglas Alton Smith, who was doing his doctoral dissertation on the late music of Sylvius Weiss. And he, when I showed up at Stanford, there were no plucked players around at all. So he attacked me. He was so happy to have, somebody like me as part of the graduate program there. It was a very well-known, important graduate program, one of very few in this country that was actually doing performance practice. That is the historical approach to performing. So it was neither a PhD kind of program that was all scholarship, nor was it a conservatory program that was all playing. It was in between. So it was like a scholarly approach to performance of early music. And it was a program that was kind of legendary from the 50s until it finally expired sometime, I think in the 90s, I believe. So at any rate, some of my best teachers when I was at San Francisco Conservatory were associated with Stanford. And I thought, wow, that's the place to go. And when I got there, Doug jumped all over me and was telling me about Sylvius Leopold Weiss and that there were manuscripts all over Europe and in Moscow. And I was like, yeah, it was just a little too much too soon. It was a little too specialized for me. I really liked him. We got along fine. But I wasn't ready to, go down. I was still working on Bach Lute Suite, so, let alone Weiss. And certainly I knew about Weiss, and like everybody else, I knew, the famous pieces of the time at Weiss. So meanwhile, if you jump to 40 years later, every morning I get up and I do the New York Times crossword puzzle. And I put on music and listen in my headphones. And I've been doing this for years, and I've just made my way through music history. And I had all the Bartow recordings of Weiss, 11 CDs of, terrific playing on the Baroque lute. And as I'm doing the crossword puzzle, I would just keep stopping going, wow, that is so beautiful. And sure enough, it was one of these late pieces that Doug was talking about that were in the Dresden manuscript, not in the British Library manuscript that was much more widely known to guitarists, because that was transcribed by Ruggero Chiesa in the late 60s. And that's what everybody had been feasting on with Weiss, and that still seems to be the case. And the Dresden manuscript had never been just put into modern notation the way Chiesa did with the with the British manuscript. And the Dresden manuscript contained the 15 suites that Doug and Tim Crawford, another scholar, deemed to be the, quote, late sonatas. And they maintained that this was Weiss's greatest music. And I just simply was following my instincts. I would hear these pieces and I go, wow, that is truly great. I want to play it. And so that it was as simple as that, for me to transcribe them for the guitar. And it's just so happened the ones that I picked. I mean, first I picked number 42 in A minor. That was the first one that got me. Good key for guitar, great. Then 45, which is one of the greatest, A major, good key for guitar. And then I started getting serious about this, and I got back in touch with Doug, and I was able to talk with him for about a year and a half before he died, and which was wonderful. And it was great to reconnect with him, and he answered a ton of questions of mine. And the first of the late sonatas was number 35 in D minor. And I thought, well, let me get into that. And that one was really fascinating. Also a good guitar key. And that was the last of the three that I transcribed.
Very informative. Did you have to go far afield to find the manuscripts? What was your source material? I see you thank the Sächsische Landesbibliothek as well as the Universität Bibliothek for their letting you publish the tablatures. But what did you work off of when you were transcribing?
Well, that's right. I mean, first of all, years ago, you would have had to get microfilm or go to Europe or, get into these libraries. But now the internet makes this stuff so accessible. There's a whole site that's devoted to Weiss. And that's where I first found what I found was primitive, very primitive modern notation transcriptions, which was great because Baroque lute tablature is, I'm like fine with Renaissance lute tablature. Baroque lute tablature is, it's the tuning is different. There's all the extra bass strings. So I was really glad to have that because there were definitely places I needed to check. But luckily there was this kind of primitive transcription with, no sense of what note belonged to what voice or anything. I mean, and rhythmically ridiculous, but the basic notes were there. So between that and the tablature, which was accessible to me on this Weiss site, this whole site devoted to Weiss, I was able to do that. And then I would listen to the Bartók recordings and just make sure, double check. There were a couple places actually where Bartók changed some music. They're just trying to think of at the end of the second movement of the A minor sonata, there's something odd rhythmically that he rewrites. I understand why he did it, but I checked the tablature and it's definitely not the way it's written. So, there's always little details and things like that, And the thing about the late Weiss pieces, they're not all in Weiss's hand. So we have the tablature, but he had scribes, he had students, He also, though, guarded these late sonatas. They were very dear to him, apparently. And he, like Paganini, a lot of these composers, it's a different, we live in an age where let's hope it goes viral, But back then, it was more like, these are my personal repertoire pieces. I don't want anybody else to get their mitts on them, So he, would share them with students, but these were not that widely disseminated, these late pieces.
Interesting. And we'll just put a pin in the transcribing pitfalls, especially with the bass. I saw you made a mention to struggling with the 13 courses and rearranging the bass notes and everything. But we'll touch on that a little bit later. But let's take a step back and talk about what drove you to create your own transcriptions. Why not settle for someone else's?
I didn't know of anybody else's. That's what I'm saying. This music is not well known. Okay. And not only that, I don't trust anybody else. I have, since I was a student, I'm certainly interested in other people's transcriptions, but even people like Barueco, who's got a lot of integrity in his transcriptions, I disagree with in many details, many places. I want to do my own. And I've got enough of a background in composing and theory and everything else. I feel, and God knows in experience at this point, I'm happy to consult other people. But when I was a student, there were a lot of Targa transcriptions that were played, or Segovia revisions of Targa transcriptions, or Segovia's own transcriptions. These things, I mean, they were inspiring but reckless, And Carol and Targa. I mean, look at Targa is a product of the 19th century. He has no problem just rewriting somebody's piece. And one of the things when you transcribe is you have to develop a kind of sense of musical ethics, a sense of morality about what you can change, what you can't change, what at some point renders a piece unplayable. I mean, I remember I love Brahms, and certainly at that period in my life, I was killing myself to try to, play Brahms piano music on the guitar. I spent over a year transcribing a Brahms intermezzo before I finally admitted, even though parts of it sounded great on the guitar, this was unfair to the piece,
Yeah.
So, I just learned to have my own counsel about these things, and I don't ever just take somebody's word for it, because too often when I've looked, I've went, wait a minute, why did you do that? Or, had some problem or issue, or been thankful that at least I looked, but I never, I learned a long time ago just to feel good that I knew what the decisions were.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, by the way, with lute music, it's not such a big deal. That's the easiest thing to transcribe, because the texture is right for the guitar. In Baroque lute music, you have to, put some basses up an octave. You have to occasionally thin out some low chords, that fit, that are very low, but, with the open bass strings work on the lute. But those are pretty easy problems to solve. The hardest thing with Baroque lute music is to find a way to notate it, since the tablature doesn't show you the length of notes. And how do you notate it so that you're illuminating the counterpoint without getting fussily academic about it? So it's more a matter of a notational issue and a fingering issue, for sure, to figure out ways to finger it on the guitar. But compared to transcribing piano music or Bach cello suites where you have to add notes, it's really not all that hard. I did these because, as far as I could see, these pieces were among Weiss's very greatest pieces, and they just weren't available to guitarists. It took me one day to talk Mel Bay into it. Bill Bay, the son of Mel Bay, who's the president of the company. But I basically told him what I'm telling you. He went, all right, let's do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to pass up.
Yeah, and I've got the background for it, and luckily I have the official degree and all this kind of stuff. So and I knew the great scholar in the music who gave me his blessing. I mean, originally he wanted the Lute Society to publish this music.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but the fact is he died, and the Lute Society then said to me, Alan, we were going along with this because we revere Doug, but the fact is that we don't really. We don't really know distribution. We don't think we're really the best place for you to do this. We'll give it our blessing. And the president of the Lute Society gave me some good feedback, which I incorporated into, and that's one of the reasons why we published the tablature and all that. But it was Ron McFarlane, the great lutenist who's on the board of the Lute Society of America. He said, why don't you tell Alan to try Mel Bay? And I thought, oh, yeah, I didn't even think of that. And, so that's how it happened.
Yeah, and they did an absolutely beautiful job. The publication, the artwork, and really, I think this really seems to be your magnum opus in transcriptions. I mean, I have your box suites right here. It seems like you put in a whole preface and everything that went into it, and a postscript. It really seems like you took careful time and
it's a different publisher. That's all,
Yeah.
and they love to have. I mean, I'm happy to do it. They encourage, especially in a larger volume like this, introductions and historical perspective. That wasn't an option with International Music, and also International Music. I was their only guitar person, and they weren't very guitar oriented. They didn't even know, where really how to market it that much. I mean, those things have been around, and I see people around the world play them, but it's nice to go with Mel Bay because they really know the guitar market.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I will confess, by the way, though, that there's one mistake in the last sonata where the page turns are misaligned. They have already corrected this, but until the first printing sells out. So I apologize. I mean, it's fabulous music. I hope that doesn't deter anybody. That will be corrected. We've already corrected it. And a few little missing cautionary accidentals and things like that I discovered when I looked at it again. I mean, no matter how much you go over this stuff, you know it so well, you almost don't see certain things. Also, by the way, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Don Golphin, who I thank in the introduction to the book. But Don, who's on the board of the Guitar Society, was great. I would send him stuff to just, objectively read through, and he had some, really good fingering ideas, and it was just like he played kind of devil's advocate with me about things, and that was really helpful.
Yeah, to have someone sort of cross-check you, keep you in line. Yeah, and I guess that with that page turn error, it's something that ripping out a page and some masking tape won't fix.
Right. I worked. They basically used my finale files with just some small. They changed the margins and things like that. But they would send me these PDFs, and I thought it was really obvious how the page. The first two sonatas are fine, but the last one is just off by page. There should be a blank page there. But you know what? As Don, I showed it to Don, and as he said, well, it's just typical of so much music where they don't, consider page turns. And so,
Yeah, that's really another bother of transcriptions is the formatting. You sort of have to be a tech whiz in whatever software you use to really get it to lay out well. You can't just throw it to the wind and keep it default finale.
Although absolutely. But actually, I got a lesson years ago from Theodore Presser, who published some of my compositions. And when they published contemporary music, they asked the composer to, do the typesetting of it. And so they gave me a great crash course, and I sort of followed their guidelines. So I pretty much know how to do that. It took me a while to realize Mel Bay was, I did it as well as I could. And then I thought, well, they're going to redo this and put it in their own, formatting or whatever. No, they just went with what I sent them. Apparently it was good enough that they just went, oh, great. We're just going to go with that. But they never took a while before I realized, oh, that's what you're doing.
I think one of the best classes I've ever taken, and this was at Temple. It was a music formatting class in technology. And basically we poured over the book Behind Bars by Elaine Gould.
Which you got me to buy.
Yeah. It was fantastic.
That's a good book, yeah.
Yeah, the things you don't know, and it's just a golden reference book. It's fantastic. So ratcheting it back, talking more about transcriptions. I mean, having been your student for quite a long time, I perform many of your transcriptions, and like the Bach cello suites, your Asturias, and even some of the Weiss sonatas that you sent to me before even thinking of publishing it. So you somehow managed to preserve the harmonic integrity, counterpoint and voicings, and it's still makes the fingerings achievable, if not comfortable. It really says something of your command over the guitar and what you're doing, and thoughtfulness when it fits in your hand and it feels like it was meant for guitar. So, really, what's your method behind that? I know you touched on it a little bit, but really to get it fit in the palm of your hand.
Well, I mean, there's no single rule for any of this, but I think one thing that I learned is that you can virtuously, let's say you're transcribing a keyboard piece for the guitar, you can virtuously include almost all the notes, but you've made something that is just kind of stiff and clunky on the guitar. And, just through experience, you learn that you have to find this place where you're being true to the original, but you're also being true to the spirit of the guitar. And there's also, by the way, a difference in composers. I mean, I've been transcribing a lot of Mozart wind music recently for the guitar. And when you transcribe Bach, for instance, like the Bach cello suites, there's a certain almost gnarly quality, right, to Bach, right? I mean, we know it's dense music. And if you feel that density when you're playing it to a certain extent, that's okay. I mean, maybe a great example of that is Brahms, who transcribed the Chaconne for the piano. And he transcribed it for the left hand alone because he wanted the pianist to experience some of the difficulty that was built into the music for the violinist. In other words, it shouldn't sound easy, shouldn't feel easy, okay? That's not true of Mozart. No matter what's going on in Mozart, it needs to sound graceful and elegant, Schubert as well. And so if you can't find a fingering and you can't find a way to, that's possible to make that music have the kind of natural, effortless flow that's part of that style, then maybe you're not doing the right piece, and for me, I mean, I just try to live with these things for a long time before I, would think about publishing them, because inevitably when you go to try to perform them and you just find that something is just too clunky and awkward, you need to find another solution, So I might transcribe a piece very quickly, but I've learned to live with it quite a while and try to get it to a performance level, because that's the real test, whether something's truly working, And you can't believe the stuff I've transcribed. All 16 Brahms waltzes. Brahms is really hard for the guitar because it's so thick. I've transcribed, an entire set of Schubert dances. I mean, I think it's 15 or 16 movements of those actually that inspired Brahms. I mean, I've been pretty ambitious with what I've transcribed, but, I've just learned that some things just, they're just too ungrateful. You might enjoy learning the music by trying to play it, but when I was younger, I would take on things and they were fun for me, but they wouldn't be fun for an audience, or it would take, just such a monster guitarist to, and I think I'm a good average, metric for guitar playing. In other words, I'm a pretty good guitarist, but I'm not Elliot Fisk, let's say, who will, play Mozart piano sonatas. And I've heard him do that and was unconvinced, frankly. But, so you just, there's no magic rule here. You just, through a lot of experience, I think, begin to, have a feel for what's working, what's not working, or to try a different approach. But as I said before, you have to have kind of a sense of musical ethics. So, yeah, you have to really understand the music. If you're transcribing from piano, let's say, to guitar, that is where you're reducing the music. You have to say, okay, where do I have to take out so much that I've, lost something really essential to the music? When you're doing the Bach cello suites, you're adding bass notes. I find most transcriptions of the Bach cello suites get too carried away and add too much. Bach might have done that, but I feel I want to add as little as possible to make it sound full on the guitar, but I find it presumptuous to add these fancy bass lines, even though, you could certainly find the possibility for them in the music.
Yeah, and dovetailing with that, the concessions you make in your transcription, so omitting a voice here and there for fingering purposes, shifting a voice. I mean, how far do you take it before you do injustice to the piece? And I know I've seen in the Lute Suites transcriptions, not yours. I forget exactly who did it. It'll come to me. But he added some suggestions above the actual bar line. So you can play this or that if you want. It's just sort of my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to take that case by case, really. I mean, certainly when it comes to Bach, one of the things you can look at is Bach's own transcriptions. The way he turned the fifth cello suite into the third lute suite, the way he turned the third violin partita into what we call the fourth lute suite. Those are fascinating. And Bach takes a free approach that we wouldn't. I mean, like where he really sometimes changes rhythms around. He, like in the gavotte of the third violin partita, he rewrites the ending fairly substantially. Things that we wouldn't presume to do as transcribers, but it sure is very interesting. In the case of Brahms waltzes, for instance, they were so popular. They were originally published for four-hand piano, and then Brahms made a version for regular two-hand piano, but they were so popular that he made a simplified version. And that was great. So then I'm looking at Brahms himself, how he would simplify it and still feel good about, a less virtuosic player playing them. So that's what kind of allowed me to do those with a clear conscience. You could see his own approach, like the way sometimes he would put something down an octave, something that was quite virtuosic in the, two-hand piano adult version. He would just make it, but it still sounded beautiful and it still was real Brahms. So, it's just piece by piece. If you're dealing with counterpoint, well, then you got to be really careful if you leave out a voice. I mean, sometimes I think you can put a voice up an octave and it's still, within the texture. I mean, what I try to do is certainly to preserve, in tonal music, you basically have the twin pillars of the upper line and the bass line. That was the great innovation of the Baroque era. Mm-hmm. And it's the stuff in the middle that you can kind of move around a little bit. So certainly within a phrase, if there's a melodic arc, I'm going to absolutely leave that alone if I at all can. I may have to go down an octave. Let's say something goes like this and ends, and there's a breath, and then it does it again and does it again. Well, at some point I may need, I'm thinking of the Debussy, Made with the Flaxen Hair. It does that 3 times on the piano, and on the guitar you can go up and then down and up, for instance. And so you lose 1 octave, but you still have that feeling of climbing that way. Yeah. And on the guitar, it's also good to remember that on the piano, changing of octaves is sometimes, that's a coloristic device on the piano. We have other ways of doing color. So you can substitute playing, Ponticello or something like that for a change in color that a pianist changes octaves for. So again, you really just have to understand the music, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And be willing to translate it. It's like translating poetry ultimately. If you translate poetry from another language word for word, maybe you feel very virtuous, but you've lost the poetry.
Yeah, and I feel like you have to have an understanding of the composer themselves. So obviously you do. So take Granados, for instance. It almost sounds, even though he composed for piano and a whole bunch of other instruments, it sounds like he's composing for guitar on another instrument. So it just translates.
Well, that's the lucky thing about Spanish composers, because especially the Spanish nationalist composers, because they were trying to evoke the guitar in their music. By the way, I've retranscribed Leyenda, which actually should be called Prelude, and certainly not Asturias. I've retranscribed it, and I got rid of all those triplets because those aren't in the original at all. That's a guitar invention. And I finally realized, you really don't need to do that. You can actually play it much closer to the way Albéniz wrote it. I mean, that's my first allegiance, is to the composer. Mm-hmm. And to really look at the original. And, for instance, you mentioned Granados. It drives me crazy that the famous Yobet edition of the Fifth Granados Spanish Dance just arbitrarily puts the melody down an octave in the middle of it, just because it gets a nice, satisfying guitar sound. It's doable, but Granados didn't do that in the piano. There's no reason. I mean, for me, most guitarists play some version of that, where just for coloristic contrast. But Granados didn't feel any need to do that on the piano. And that's what I mean. I mean, like, you look at even famous transcriptions and you see stuff that, transcribers do just because it makes a juicy sound on the guitar. And, well, that's fine. That's fine. But that's not what I want to do. I want to be as close to the original as I can. That's, for me, the composer is God, not the guitar,
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very easy to get cutesy-wootsy, and especially when there's harmonics to be had, and it just won't fit. Right. So I guess that leads me to my next segues to my next question. So I remember you charging me, as well as my peers back at Temple, with transcribing pieces on our own, and then having us perform them. And I absolutely dreaded this, but I was all the better for doing it. It was a slog because you have so many considerations. So what would you say are the most common pitfalls you observe when reviewing or hearing a student's transcription? And what can you say are the benefits to transcribing, even if you're not a serial transcriptionist like yourself?
Well, I think the benefits are that, even if you go and play somebody else's transcription, ultimately, it really makes you confront the music and really understand what the essence of the music is. So it's a great thing to go through. I certainly urge everybody. I mean, playing transcriptions by famous guitarists who have lots of integrity, like, Barweko or Williams or whoever, playing, certainly there's nothing wrong with playing their transcriptions by any means, but still look at the original, see the choices they made, and there may be some little things that you go, ooh, you could do it this way instead of that way. I mean, it's just gets you closer to the heartbeat of the music. I think number one, when you're transcribing, is you got to find the right key. And you got to be willing maybe to do something in one key. And if you run into trouble, try another key. And sometimes you can be really pleasantly surprised that the music breathes better in a different key. But I think the big mistake for everybody when they're transcribing, especially if they're transcribing keyboard music or string quartet music or, larger things that you have to condense to play on the guitar, is being too literal. It's like even if you can play every single note, you've often made something that is just that loses flow and gracefulness on the guitar. And so that's where you're confronted to say, could I leave this out? Is this really essential? Certainly if keyboard music, there's lots of doublings and things like that. So that's an obvious thing. To me, the big issue is that you have to preserve the bass line. And by that, I don't mean, that you can't change octaves in the bass line, but you need to preserve as much as possible the chord inversions, because those are very important to tonal composers. There's a reason why something's in root position, why something's in first or second inversion. So, you got to be really careful about messing with that. Occasionally, you might have to. Occasionally, something sounds better on the guitar using an open string. So you have to be open-minded. And then, you really have to preserve the harmony. And that's can be problematic when you're doing keyboard music, where there might be, especially in 19th century music, where there can be some fairly thick harmonies that or French Impressionism, for instance. Do you get, have you really gotten the flavor of these complex chords, even if you have to leave out a note or two? So the other side of it, though, is that the guitar has a certain resonance and a certain, the overtones and things like that sometimes can fill in. So it's just such a big subject, and it's a wonderful subject. But you can't give simplistic answers, because each piece has got its own set of challenges to really do it well.
Yeah, and I would ask the benefits of that. So, what would you think are the benefits of transcribing besides eating your veggies, doing your homework? I could imagine, for me personally, it was getting to know the composer and how they composed.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, I'm transcribing all this Mozart right now, which trying to interest Mel Bay in publishing. He says that guitarists buy Renaissance music, Baroque music, Romantic music. They don't buy classical music, which is unbelievable to me. And I know he's right. But I mean, he says Mozart doesn't sell on the guitar. But he said, we'll see how the Weiss does. And revisit it, so everybody please buy that Weiss so I can publish all this fantastic Mozart I've been doing. So I mean, I got into transcribing, frankly, because when I started playing classical guitar seriously, like, I want to play Beethoven, I want to play Mozart, I want, all these famous composers who didn't write for the guitar. I just wanted to get my hands on them, I've come to, totally love the guitar repertoire, and, feel like we have a wonderful repertoire, especially in terms of the range, more than almost any other instrument. But, for me, it was just to get to know, like you said, to get to know important composers who I loved. I loved Brahms. I wanted to play Brahms, not just listen to somebody else playing him, in a string quartet or on a piano. I wanted to do it myself. And so that's really, that it was as simple as that for me. And again, I just think, when you do transcriptions, it forces you to really understand what makes the music tick, because that's what you have to preserve. So it's a wonderful way to get inside of music. By the way, I have this wonderful mandolin student at Temple, Gabe Licati, who I'm just really loving working with, because there's no place to study classical mandolin in this country. And so he's with me, and we're doing great. And he's transcribing guitar music for the mandolin. He just transcribed some merits that we studied in guitar class, and he put it onto the mandolin. It sounds great, but he had the same issue. The mandolin's got fewer strings than the guitar. I mean, they're double strings, but, 4 courses and different tuning. And so he had, to deal with the same issues that we are. He had to thin out chords and things like that. And, it's great. He's making his own repertoire and going through, just the kind of stuff that we go through.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating to hear. I have heard and sat in on some of his recitals, and it was fantastic. Yeah.
Yes, no, he's terrific. In fact, I just performed at Gretna Music. I just played with fantastic bandoneon player, played Piazzolla with him, and Gabe did the concert, like this sort of student concert, sort of the appetizer to the main concert. And Gabe's terrific. But he's really getting interested in transcribing because he wants to expand the repertoire for his instrument. And interesting to see him attracted to some of the guitar repertoire and wanting to make that work on the mandolin.
Well, I look forward to him leading the mandolin renaissance.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, there might be he might be the person who starts the first mandolin department in this country. I mean, I've talked with the dean at Temple. They're actually quite interested in the idea.
Yeah, fascinating. So, what are your personal favorite transcriptions? I think you would be remiss if you didn't mention West Side Story.
Yeah, well, that's right, and especially since I've got a letter from Leonard Bernstein approving of my transcription, so that's cool.
Yeah.
In my safe deposit box. So that was courtesy of Christopher Parkening, who wanted Bernstein to orchestrate them sort of in the manner of Fantasy for a Gentleman of Rodrigo. In other words, to take these pretty accurate transcriptions and expand them and orchestrate them into a concerto of some sort. Bernstein was close to the end of his life, and he was like, no, I'm not doing that. But I remember Chris Parkin called me up and he said, Alan, I've got a letter from Leonard Bernstein about your transcriptions. And I said, well, Chris, could you send it to me? He goes, oh, I kind of wanted to keep it. And I said, but Chris, they're my transcriptions. He said, all right. So he sent it to me. And it's great because Bernstein went through all of them, made a few little suggestions and things like that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You can take, I mean, in the case of West Side Story, they work, I think, largely because Bernstein very consciously was evoking Spanish dance music for, I mean, he even called, I think, I Feel Pretty. He marks in the score a la Española, like a Spanish dance, Tonight, he marks that as a begin in the style of a begin, like a Latin American dance.
Mm-hmm.
Is a Canarios, right, with the hemiola. It's the same, it's the same as the famous Sans Canarios. So these pieces with their Latin and Spanish inspirations largely were naturals for the guitar. Mm-hmm. They really were. You can, the amazing thing is, look at Tárrega. You can make anything work if you really want to. I mean, Tárrega would take, parts of operas, Beethoven symphonies, things like that. So, one way or another, you can make something work. It's just, can you sleep at night?
Yeah, the concessions you make.
Have you left out, like there's no way I'm playing Beethoven's Eroica Symphony on the guitar, even if you could do a few measures of it convincingly, which would be fun for your own enjoyment, Yeah. I learned a real lesson with Tárrega's transcription of a Mendelssohn string quartet. It's from one of his early 2-string quartets, fantastic piece. And the opening of it, that part, works great on the guitar. But then there's this middle section with a full string quartet playing, pretty rich counterpoint that he basically has to rewrite. And as much as I love that piece, Julian Bream recorded that piece, but if you play it, you'd have to say this is by Mendelssohn / Tárrega, And in general, that doesn't interest me. I mean, if you have to rewrite it that much to make it work, but that didn't bother Tárrega. He happily recomposed other people's pieces. He would take snippets of Schumann and call it a prelude. In fact, the famous Oremus, which is the last of Tárrega's preludes, which was found on his music stand when he died, and was long thought to be an original piece of Tárrega's. It's the middle section of a somewhat obscure Schumann piano piece that he rejiggered to sound great on the guitar. In the Schumann, it's a quick piece. On Tárrega makes it an adagio. So it's a different attitude. Thank God. I mean, Tárrega did all this stuff. I'm glad we have it, and that's a gorgeous piece. Not something I somehow would do myself.
Yeah. Especially with copyright. Long.
Yeah.
But so any recommendations on literature around Weiss, or maybe navigating Baroque technique that you would have? Anything around ornamentation?
Well, it's such a huge subject.
Yeah.
I would say the one thing that guitarists should do is listen to some of the great Baroque lute players like Robert Bartow, like uh, uh, forgetting his name, the English. Nigel North, right, that's what I was thinking of, who's a beautiful Baroque lute player. Nigel North, by the way, does not play the Bach lute suites. He thinks they're keyboard pieces and they're not idiomatic for the lute. And he plays all the cello and violin pieces, and he does his own transcription of the fifth cello suite. I mean, he takes into account what Bach did with that. But that's pretty fascinating. He just thinks that they are not lutistic. I mean, the E major is like a horrible key for the Baroque lute. So the dee da 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 da, like it just doesn't make any sense that it's pretty well accepted at this point that all the so-called lute music was for the Lautenwerk, a keyboard, that Bach enjoyed playing that imitated the lute, but they're essentially keyboard pieces. That's a big subject. But I think if you're interested in that music and getting your hands on it in a stylistic way, listen to these great lute players play it. That certainly is very edifying. And Baroque ornamentation's a big subject, but I think there's still some good introductory books, like looking at Robert Donington, the book called The Interpretation of Early Music, or even a handbook to Baroque performance practice by him. There's a number of nice introductory things, and I personally think you don't need to go crazy. Actually, if you want to go crazy, it's in the 17th century. One of the things that I learned studying this music is that, in a sense, the high Baroque of Handel and Bach and Couperin, the final flowering of the Baroque, it really kind of brought together and in some respects kind of simplified a lot of things that were much more diverse. I mean, if you start playing, mid 17th century French lute music and really want to get into the ornamentation of that the way they did it, it's incredibly convoluted and finicky. The guy who started the program at Stanford was a harpsichordist. And back in the 50s, his name was Putnam Aldrich. And he wrote a book called The Principal Agrément. So that's the French word for ornamentation. And it was about this thick. Or, you can, like a book like this, which is a pretty thick tome, Ornamentation in Baroque and Post-Baroque Lute Music by Frederick Neumann. This book is like about 600 pages, 600 pages of the exceptions to the rules. So you can, it's a pretty slippery slope. However, I think if you really learn, what appoggiaturas really are about, and you learn, what that trills are elaborated appoggiaturas, and you learn, the handful of basic ornaments like mordants and part-of-voix and things like that. And then you learn how Italians did more melodic ornamentation and filled in the intervals in things. And if you learn the basic French ornaments, like the ones I just mentioned, and you learn to, like a jazz musician, just embellish and fill out melodies, you can go a long way on that without making yourself, become a scholar or go nuts about it.
Yeah, not to go off on a tangent, but with performance, it can be a little intimidating, especially taking on Weiss or sometimes even Bach. It almost feels like uncharted territory. How do you go about first practicing these? So sight unseen, net new Weiss sonata, you open the book, page 1. Do you forego all the ornamentations?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this music's not that dependent on ornamentation. Weiss actually uses, Weiss has a little comma that goes in one direction for upper appoggiatura and the other direction for a lower appoggiatura. You can elaborate those appoggiaturas as trills or mordants, and I wouldn't lose sleep over it. It's because his music, I mean, these three sonatas that I transcribed, they're fantastic. And, the ornament, it doesn't depend on ornamentation. And a lot of the ornamentation's written out anyway, just like in Bach. That's the thing, is Bach is pre-ornamented. And, if you compare Bach to Handel, Bach writes out many things that Handel just leaves in more sketch form, because Handel was more of a vocal composer and he expected vocalists to want to do their own embellishments. This Weiss music you can approach, like Bach lute suites. It doesn't need you to do too many things. Weiss, for the most part, uses those two signs, which I just notate as appoggiaturas. Appoggiaturas certainly can be, if you have time, turn them into trills. Occasionally he notates a trill, and occasionally he notates a mordant in a specific way. But for the most part, it's not that daunting. It's just great music. What I would say is, if you know the music of Weiss, my feeling is that Weiss was always very good and sometimes great. But in his early music, I find it a little bit inconsistent. And sometimes his modulations, to me, seem slightly arbitrary. They're charming, but they don't feel always inevitable. Forget that when you get to the late music. Everything, it's like Bach. You just feel like you're on terra firma. I think one thing that happened for Weiss was that it made a huge difference to him when the 11-course Baroque lute turned into a 13-course Baroque lute. That really seems to have inspired and liberated him. And also the bass lines in the late music are much more active and motivic than they are in the early music. So this late music, I would say just dive into it and enjoy it. Just let it speak to you, you don't need to know that much, because it's just, I think if you're familiar with Bach or, late Baroque music, it's going to be a language that you understand. One thing that is really interesting about the late music, though, is that it's on such a big scale. They're, especially like the easy example would be courants. Bach courant, 80, 85 measures on average. Some of the Weiss courants are 180 measures. And the other thing that you see, Weiss was essentially more progressive than Bach was. Bach was definitely, very conservative and not really that concerned with the new Rococo style that was emerging in his time, or the galant style. And Weiss was more attuned to that. And you see in some of these big pieces of these sonatas that I transcribed, real foreshadowings of sonata form, where you have real recapitulations of thematic material. So they're always rounded binary forms. And in other words, you really feel like where Bach will often just make it, let's say in an allemande or a courant, to the home key, approaching the end of the piece. Weiss, like 2/3 of the way, says, here we are, and here is the thematic material. And so there's a big difference in terms of structure from Bach in that way. Bach does that sometimes, like the prelude to the second lute suite is certainly kind of a sonata form in embryo. But in these Weiss sonatas, he's doing that consistently. Mm-hmm. So they're very fascinating in that way. They're also, he calls them sonatas. Most of us would call them suites, but like so much late Baroque music, they're elements of suites and sonatas in them. In other words, you see there's movements called allegro, adagio, presto, which come from the Italian sonata tradition, not from the French suite tradition. And so they're all mixed in together.
Yeah, well, they're just gorgeous and they're fun to play, especially when you get into that Baroque flow. So are you performing these sonatas anytime soon, and where? Or are you performing in general?
I'm just beginning to perform live again. Most of my performances coming up are chamber music performances. I have performed all the sonatas in this book, but that was a couple of years ago. when I was really getting to know these pieces. This book should have come out at least a year ago. It got slowed up because of the pandemic. So I'm going to be revisiting these. At the moment, though, I'm obsessed with playing Mozart. So that's and hopefully to publish this whole group of Mozart divertimenti that I've been working on. So I will come back to the Weiss pretty soon now that it's out, and I feel like I should be publishing it, maybe even recording it.
Yeah, well, I look forward to hearing it, and keep us posted, really.
Oh, I will.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Good questions. And you got some editing to do here. We covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah.